This is North Pod, a North Melbourne fan podcast, hosted by Jason Hunt.
Now the backs there are. He backs it. He kicks it. Oh, the fall from Dersma. This is the speed of the culture. 3 bounces down the wing. He keeps going. 4 bounces. Joining the chorus. The Can't Lose Kangas are AFLW premiers.
Hello and welcome back to 2025. Welcome back to North Pod. It's been a little while since I've got behind the microphone. It's probably been a little while since you've chucked the headphones on and have had a listen. Sure, you've probably had nothing to listen to the entire summer because this would be all you would be listening to. So, yeah, thanks for tuning back in. Welcome if you're a new listener to North Pod. Yeah, going to be some exciting new things and some changes for the pod for 2025. We'll get to those things, I guess, as they happen. I guess, personally, I've welcomed my first child into the world during December, so there's been some life changes there. But Raf is happy and healthy in the world, so that's exciting for me. And also, certainly a change. And yeah, I guess things could be a little bit different this year as a result of that. We'll just have to wait and see. And wait another 5 or 6 years and I'll have grown my own co-host. So yeah, that's, I guess, what's been happening with me. I did react to the AFLW Grand Final win and said it probably wasn't going to be that I was going to be able to do a bit of a season review for the women, and that did come to pass. He arrived into the world a couple of days after that, so it was nice of him just to hold on so we could enjoy that Grand Final win. And then, yeah, I guess that my past month or so has been pretty consumed by that. I guess to catch you up a little bit, I am going to be pre-recording a few episodes here. So whilst I'm recording this early January, this probably won't. I'll probably start back up the podcast in maybe late Jan, something like that. So this is probably when you are most likely to be hearing this. I just think, important I get on top of a few things and give myself a bit of breathing room as the season gets going. So, yeah, there's going to be a couple of episodes across the next couple of weeks as you're hearing this that, I guess a bit more of a fun look at a few different things, a little bit more timeless, so not necessarily reacting to what's happening, but kind of, either looking forward or looking back on the past. So if there is something big in North Melbourne land that has happened that I'm not talking about, that is why. So that's I guess what we can expect. I guess some timeless maybe aspects of analytics, but also a bit more fun, I guess, to be frank about it. So I guess let's jump right into this episode. I've called it the most important player bracket. So many of you would be familiar with brackets. It's a pretty American thing, really, where you bracket up these things, and you're picking a bracket. It might be in an American sport. You're trying to pick from that playoff bracket who's going to win, or you essentially just having some things going head to head, and you're either predicting what's going to happen or choosing what you'd like to happen. So what I have done is grabbed 32 of our AFL men's listed players and put them into a bracket, a bit of a tournament style single elimination bracket. So the way that I did that was I picked 8 defenders, 8 forwards, 8 mids, and then 8 kind of dual position or position unclear type players, and put them into, I guess, groups of 8 so that they would siphon down into the best from each of those sections, and then they will play off against each other, so to speak. I as a result of that, just because of how many players I could fit in there, I have left out some depth players or some players that it's fair to say are probably at the bottom of the pecking order as it stands right now, or players that we just haven't seen yet. So I guess for what it's worth, the players that aren't included, Miller Bergman was sort of the 9th defender there, so he missed out. The forwards, Cooper Harvey, River Stevens, Jacob Constanti, Geordie Payne, and CCJ. Again, you could probably put CCJ in there if he wasn't on the long-term injury list, but I think he's certainly down the pecking order at the moment as a result of that. In the midfield, Urquhart and Goad missed out. I guess the mids obviously includes the rucks. And then I was tossing and turning, but ultimately it's not really going to matter. Dylan Stephens hasn't made the cut, but it was between him and Will Phil for the last spot. And I think it's fair to say that either of those two, probably aren't going to be the most important player. So, yeah, I went with Will Phil, but it just as easily could have been Dylan Stephens. I had to cut one of those two. And then the rest, so Toby Pink, Matt Whitlock, and Finbar Maley were kind of those dual position or depth players that didn't make the cut. Whitlock's an interesting one because he could potentially be a very important player in the future, but I just thought in the interest of knowing essentially nothing about him at the AFL level, I had to make a cut. And it was actually in that spot, in that dual position / depth area, it was pretty hard. I guess the one that I could have swapped him with would be Braden George, who we also know not a lot about at AFL level, but at least he's been on the list for a couple of years. So, we've got a little bit of VFL form and a little bit of training form to go by. So, anyway, I those fringe cases, although it can seem a bit harsh to leave them out, I think it's fair to say ultimately they're not going to be the most important player, so it's probably not the end of the world. In terms of then how I'm trying to frame this, because I haven't done this yet, so to speak, so I'm going to be talking my way through it as I go. I think for me, the way I'm trying to frame most important player is if you had to give up one of these players, which one would you want to keep? Maybe it's for a trade or it's free agency. Which one would you prefer to keep? I'm taking into account form and age and on-field performance, present and future. But I think ultimately it's a feel thing. It's a vibe thing. It's a little bit intangible because you're trying to combine all of these things that are really hard to compare to one another. And obviously we'll get to a point where it's going to be really hard to compare players in totally different positions and totally different stages of their careers. So I think that's part of the fun of it. I definitely would love you to agree or disagree with me. So once you've listened to this and you're feeling angry and you want to tell me how wrong I got it, feel free to hit me up in the comments or on social media. We can discuss it. Yeah, I think that's pretty much everything. I guess the last thing is I've randomly placed them into the seedings of those brackets. So once I picked my top 8 for each section, they're just random. So it could be there's a few matchups early on that seem like the two best in that position, and that it is what it is. Ultimately, I think we'll be able to whittle it down and we'll end up with, the best player anyway. So yeah, as I said, I'm not too concerned by it. All right, hopefully that all makes sense. If it doesn't, I'm sure it'll make a little bit more sense as we get into it. I think I'll just go through the first stage. So this part's going to take the longest potentially, but there's definitely going to be some matchups that aren't really much of a competition. So some of them will be faster than others. We start with an interesting one actually. So we're going to start in defence, and it is Aidan Corr versus Callum Dawson. Now this is an interesting one because Corr is definitely a better player, a more important player to us now, and a more established player. Callum Dawson is probably depth, you'd have to say. There is a chance, though, he could be a long-term piece for us. It's only a chance, though. It's definitely not as though, he's cemented as the sort of player that's going to be around long-term. So, yeah, this is a tough one. I think I have to go with Aidan Corr because I still think he's got some years left in him. He's an experienced player. I know at times he can be a bit divisive, but I think in terms of if you had to give one of them up, yeah, I still think there's some good years left in Aidan Corr. If he was maybe a couple of years older, maybe you'd go with Callum Dawson based on potential. But yeah, I think I've got to go with Aidan Corr on that one. He's had a good 18 months of football. We know he's never going to be one of the best defenders in the competition, but he's pretty reliable, especially if he's not being asked to be one out on the best forward every time. We've seen he can do that at times, depending on the matchup. Max King, he played a really good game on, a couple of games actually. So depending on the matchup, he can play a really good game, but he needs a bit of freedom and a bit of, he can't just be one out all the time. So Aidan Corr is going to take that matchup. We're going to stay in the defence. We'll go through all the defenders here. So Caleb Daniel versus Luke McDonald is the next matchup. Ooh. I mean, McDonald's the captain, but I do think it's fair to say that Caleb Daniel's probably going to give us more over the next 5-6 years. We hope. We paid a fair bit for him in terms of trade value with a second round pick. Yeah, I think I've got to give it to Caleb Daniel in terms of value. I know that Luke McDonald is one of our co-captains, but he's peaked. Let's be honest. And whilst Caleb Daniel may have also peaked, I think we've probably got some more good years left in him. It's pretty rough on McDonald. I know there's plenty out there that are really low on McDonald, but he's a great clubman. He's probably our longest tenured player at this point. I'm saying that without really thinking it too hard, but if he's not, I think he would be very close. Yeah, I think even that all being said, if Luke McDonald left, we'd still have Jai Simpkin. We'd have enough leadership around us for it to not be a complete void. So I think I've got to go with Caleb Daniel as the more valuable player to us right now. Next up, Riley Hardiman, Jackson Archer. So it's interesting that these players have ended up being quite similar in profile in terms of, Daniel and McDonald are on the other side of 25, but Hardiman and Archer are much younger. I think on exposed form from 2024, Jackson Archer so far has played better football at AFL level, but I'm pretty high on what Riley Hardiman could potentially be. That being said, I think I've got to go with Jacko Archer. Just his 2024 form, particularly that second half of the year when he burst in, was really strong considering the amount of ball that was going into our defence and what he was being asked to do. So I think I've got to go with Jackson Archer there, but Riley Hardiman could be anything. We haven't seen much of him at AFL level yet, but I think it's fair to say that 2025 could be the year that he comes in and puts some real pressure on someone like Luke McDonald. If Josh Goda, who I'm about to talk about, isn't able to get himself fit this year completely, there's definitely going to be some opportunities for Riley Hardiman, I think. So, yeah, not discounting him at all, but I think I've got to give that one to Archer. And then the final defensive matchup, Josh Goda versus Griffin Logue. It's interesting because it's pretty similar to the Core versus Callum Dawson one. Goda's injury is a concern. Like an Achilles injury does make you worry a little bit about long-term prospects. I was super high on Josh Goda coming into 24. The fact that he then injured his Achilles in round one was devastating. I mean, sure it was for him, but he was a player that in the pre-season had looked like he was ready to explode. In terms of importance to us right now, though, it's also pretty easy to forget how important a player Griffin Logue could be for us. Obviously missed most of this year, did his ACL in 2023 and was sort of on the recovery trail, and then he got another injury when he came back, so he was only able to play a couple of games this year. I think he's a super important player for us. So, again, similar to Core, that age profile is on the way up, but he's still got some good years left in him. So I think I'm going to give that one to Logue. But, Goda, again, like Riley Hardiman, could be anything. And I think as North Melbourne supporters, we've got to hope that one of those two really explodes, Goda or Hardiman. If it's both, fantastic. But we're going to need one of them to have a big year, I think. And, if it's Goda, it's probably going to be the second half of his year, just coming back from that injury. But, yeah, that's not to discount either of them. So I'll give that one to Griffin Logue. That's the first round done for all of the defenders. We move into the forward line. So like I said, I'm going to just go through it round by round. Easy one first up, Nick Larkey versus Robert Hansen Jr. Larkey wins that one. I feel like I don't need to spend too long talking about that one. Hansen Jr. showed some somewhat positive signs end of last year, but Larkey gets that one very easily. I'm not gonna waste time there. Similar again, Cam Zurhaar and Bryn Teakle. I mean, look, Teakle came in and had a good impact second half of last year, but I mean, let's be real. Cam Zurhaar, particularly given the fact that we've just put him on a massive contract, he's a more important player. So again, that's a pretty straightforward one. Then we get into, no, we don't. It's the next, I think the first round for the forwards is going to be pretty easy, actually. Zane Dersma versus Jack Darling. Yeah, I mean, it's Zane Dersma, isn't it? But sure, Jack Darling might have more impact in 2025, maybe. But Zane Dersma is the one that we've invested heavily in him at the draft. We want him to be our future, so he definitely is our more important player. Maybe Jack Darling is more important this year, but beyond that, it's got to be Zane Dersma. So he wins that matchup. And then the final one, the forward line, this was a lot faster. Paul Curtis versus Eddie Ford. It's Paul Curtis. Super important player for us. Obviously a massive presence in that forward line. He plays a weird role in that he's kind of a marking small. He does have some crumbing nous, but not as much as I'd like. He's got some great tackling pressure, which is something that's desperately needed in our forward line, and hits the scoreboard. So Paul Curtis wins that one. Eddie Ford's only on a 1-year deal, and I think's probably going to be on the fringe this year, just given where our list is at. Who knows? He might explode this year, but I just can't see a world in which in 2026 or let's say 2027 that Eddie Ford's on our list unless he's able to drastically add to his game, because I just think we've got so many young players coming through that probably have more potential than Eddie Ford. Paul Curtis definitely a more valuable player than Eddie Ford. So that's the forwards first round done pretty quickly. The midfield group. Okay, Tristan Xerri versus Bailey Scott, which is one that probably 12 months ago I would have debated a bit more heavily, but now, I mean, it's Tristan Xerri. His play in 2024 was absolutely phenomenal as a ruckman. Found plenty of the ball, a beast at clearances, big tackler. And in terms of importance to us, the fact that he is our only established ruckman in the team is massive. So it's almost a pretty obvious one with Tristan there. Bailey Scott had a really good 2022 and a really good 2023. Bit of a down 2024, and part of that is just it's more like by his standards as opposed to having an awful season. I just thought he had an average season, but was down from the previous two. He's signed on for 2 more years, so hopefully in the next 2 years we see some of his best footy. But yeah, I mean, in terms of which of them you'd prefer to lose, you'd prefer to lose Scott because he's more replaceable. Whilst we don't necessarily have absolute locks for the wing, we've got options. Whereas, Xerri goes down, it's a significant downgrade in the ruck. And I think it's not crazy to say that he was either the best or the second best ruck in the competition last year. Max Gawn won out for the All-Australian. Part of that's based on longevity, but I don't think it was an absolute certainty that Xerri was the best. And when you're playing in the second bottom side, it's pretty hard to say that, you don't have a lot of results to point to in terms of the impact that you've had. But we as North fans would know that he had a massive impact on games for us. So Tristan Xerri wins that one for sure. Finn O'Sullivan and Will Phil is an interesting one only because O'Sullivan hasn't played a game for us. I think the challenge here is Will Phil has played and we kind of know where he's at and where he's on the fringe. He's a player that I'm pretty concerned about going into, a contract year for him. He's only picked up the 1-year deal, so he is going to be on the fringe. I do think Will Phil's going to play this year, but let's be honest, in terms of value, Finn O'Sullivan as a player that we, took at number 2, we obviously value him very highly. I expect him to be playing pretty early on. And if we're going to be giving one of them up, you'd be giving up Will Phil for absolute sure. So Finn O'Sullivan wins that one out, despite not having played a game yet. It's going to be interesting to see where he finishes because, as a pick 2, you're obviously valued very highly, but he's still a bit of an unknown prospect at AFL level. So, we'll see who he matches up against next. Then, this is a brutal one. Wardlaw versus McKercher. Gosh, I almost wish I'd left this one till last because this is a really tough one. Wardlaw obviously has had the extra year at AFL level. We've seen 2 years from him in the system versus McKercher's 1. But McKercher's 2024 was really, really strong, whereas I don't know that Wardlaw's 2024 was quite as strong. Tough one. Wardlaw does have some injury concerns, but he pretty much put those behind him in 2024. He had some concussion issues, but that's not necessarily something that I'm too concerned about unless it keeps happening this year, because then it, is probably a bit of a pattern and it is in part at least due to how he's playing. And then the more obviously you accumulate, the more concerning that gets. McKercher, I just think, is an absolute jet of an outside player. I know there's been lots of comparisons with him and Zach Merritt, which I totally see. it's going to be unpopular either way. I think it's a tough first round matchup, but I think, to be honest, Wardlaw is the player that's probably harder to find. There's outside players. I just think there's probably more of them available. Whereas Wardlaw's ability just to be an absolute bull at the contest is probably a bit of a point of difference in terms of league wide. Whereas I do think, it's tough. Look, I'm going to go with Wardlaw, but I could absolutely be talking to McKercher. I think they're pretty level in terms of their importance to us long term, but I think if I had to pick one, I'm going to pick Wardlaw just because I think he's a bull and we don't necessarily have a lot of players like him in our side, whereas I do think we have some players that play similarly to McKercher, even if though McKercher is probably the best version of that. Anyway, I could talk around in circles about that one. I'm going with Wardlaw. And then the final midfield one, LDU versus Tom Powell, which is interesting because LDU is coming out of contract this year. I mean, look, it is obvious, or I think it's obvious, that LDU is the more important player and the one that we don't want to lose. It would be interesting, and I guess it'll happen soon when LDU goes up against some of those more established mids where my mind goes to. But I mean, yeah, in terms of LDU versus Powell had a great year, a really not super consistent, but more consistent than he's been. I think from memory, his start and his finish were stronger than the middle part of his year. But I guess the ceiling for Tommy Powell is definitely lower than LDU. I mean, it's it's easy to forget that LDU is probably in the top 15, 20 players in the comp, and when he is playing in a better side, I think he's going to get much more recognition for that. So yeah, I mean, LDU is the more important player. We do not want to lose him come the end of this year. We don't want to have to pay our entire salary cap to him either. But yeah, he's a super important signing that we need to hopefully get locked away before the season goes out, because yeah, there's going to be speculation until he signs about what's happening there. He can say all the right things about wanting to sign and his manager making some progress, but we're going to need to see a bit more than that, I think, to feel good about the fact that he might be staying. So yeah, massive year for LDU. He is the more important player there. All right, then we are into the dual position / the players that I couldn't really find a spot for, or a definitive spot for. So Harry Sheezel, Darcy Tucker is the first one. Shees can play all around the ground. I think it's probably fair to say he's going to play a more midfield, slightly half-forward role this year, but we know obviously he can play half-back as well. Darcy Tucker, bit of a wing, half-back hybrid. Let's be honest, it's Harry Sheezel. Darcy Tucker, both of these players, were selected every time they were fit in 2024. But yeah, I mean, Sheezel is going to be hard to beat, I think, in terms of value. So I'm just going to give it to him and move on. We can talk more about him when it's a tougher matchup. Jai Simpkin, Zach Fisher. I mean, I think we all had really high hopes for Zach Fisher's impact when he arrived, and I think he started pretty strongly, but as the season went on, we started to see some of the flaws in his game. Jai Simpkin's probably the opposite, where he started a little bit played out of position, and that forward half role that he was playing didn't necessarily work. It was harder for him to have an impact on the games. Played 2 really good games last year, and besides that would float in and out of games. As our captain, he's definitely the more important player, Jai Simpkin, but I would love to see a little bit more from him this coming year. I think that's a fair comment. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. All the talk is that he's going to play a mostly midfield role in 25, so I think that gives him the best chance to have maximum impact. But yeah, a super important player for us, Jai Simpkin. And since I've ditched Luke McDonald as the other captain, I definitely had to keep Jai Simpkin. 2 to go here in these first round matchups. Charlie Comben and Will Dawson. Both of these are those players where you're just not sure if they're attackers or defenders. I mean, on exposed form, we're going to give this one to Charlie Comben, but Will Dawson could be anything. He could be a super important player for us. Kind of like what I was saying about Matt Whitlock before this started. Will Dawson could be a pillar for us. It's a long time until that might be happening. And so it's harder to, I think you'd be happier giving him up than Charlie Comben, because we've got some exposed form for him, for Comben that is. Whether we're playing him forward or back this year, I'm not too sure. I think the talk is that he's going to go back forward. That's a confusing way to say it. I think he's going to head into the forward line in 25 is the talk. But I do have some concerns about his goal kicking. We know he's a great mark, but as a set shot, he's not a fantastic set shot. Anyway, that's probably a conversation for a different day. Charlie Comben wins that one, but yeah, Will Dawson could be a really important player for us, so I don't want to discount him. And the final round 1 matchup is Brayden George versus Luke Parker. And this is one of those tough ones where there are players that are just a completely different parts of their career, so that does make it a lot harder to compare them. Brayden George, we've seen no AFL form from, so that is a challenge. And I think, to be honest, he's pretty lucky to still be on the list, not because he doesn't have the talent, but typically players that get these really serious injuries early in their career, it can be hard to make a comeback. Luke Parker, I think, just has enough years for us to go that I think I've probably got to give him the edge here. He's going to be a super important leader for us for the next few years. His ability to play midfield and forward. I think in terms of value to the club, right now I'm seeing Brayden George as a bit of it's not a free hit, but a bonus if he's able to get fit and play well for us. Whereas Luke Parker, we need him to be a serviceable player for the next few years. Given what we've given up for him in terms of a list spot and some salary. So, yeah, I think Luke Parker has to be more valuable there, but I could see people wanting to say Brayden George just based on potential. It's just really hard to know. He's not played an AFL game and he's had several pretty serious injuries. So, yeah, I think that makes it a bit tougher for him. So that's the end of the first round. Now it's going to get a bit faster now because we're essentially, halfway through now. We've got 8 matchups here to decide round 2. I was going to give it another name, but it's just we're going into round 2 at this point. So I'm going to go back up to the defenders now. I'm sorry there's nothing visual for you to look at here, but hopefully the way I'm describing it at least it'll make sense once we get to the end of the bracket. But right now, we're in what you might consider... No, it's not quarterfinals yet. Anyway, back to the defenders. So Aidan Corr and Caleb Daniel are going head-to-head here. Tough. Who is more important to us? Caleb Daniel is a player that we have several other players that could play that role, such as Harry Sheezel, such as Zach Fisher, such as Colby McKercher. That being said, I think Caleb Daniel is going to be the best. Well, I think both he and Sheezel are probably comparable in that position. Caleb Daniel's a very good kick. Aidan Corr, on the other hand, is holding down a key defensive position, and allowing us to develop players like Will Dawson, like Matt Whitlock. These taller players that are hopefully going to be our future cogs. So both of them are important, funnily enough. I think again, based on the culture that's been set up and the fact that he's a leader, I think I've got to give this one to Aidan Corr. Caleb Daniel, I'm expecting some big things from this year, but it's hard to find serviceable or solid key position players. I think it is easier to replace a halfback. That being said, he's a very good halfback, a fantastic kick. So I don't want to. Yeah, that's what I'm happy to debate with people in the comments section. But I think Aidan Corr is a more important player to us. The other matchup here in the defenders, Jackson Archer and Griffin Logue. Again, this is tough because one's at the start of their career and Griffin Logue's not that old. Let me just check how old he is. Yeah, he's 26. He'll be 27 towards the start of the season. I think it's got to be Griffin Logue for this one. It's easy to be sucked in and think he's a bit older than that just because he's come from somewhere else. But just a lot more established form. Similar to Aiden Core, he's a super important position for us. So I think despite how high I am on Jackson Archer after the year he's had, I think it's got to be Griffin Logue for that one. He's just it's harder to find a player in his position and of his quality. So Griffin Logue there. Then we go to the forwards. I mean, again, it's going to be pretty quick. Nick Larkey versus Cam Zerha. It's Nick Larkey. He's, vitally important to our forward line. Our best forward player by a long way. And whilst we want Cam Zerha can be a bit of a tease, let's be honest. He has flashes of brilliance and he'll play a really, really match-winning game. And then there'll be another couple of games where he virtually has no impact. And I think that is the concern with Cam and why potentially you would be more willing to give him up than Nick Larkey. So, yeah, Larkey wins that one. But I do hope this year we're able to see maybe Cam at least challenge that position a little bit and play some more consistent football. He is a different player, obviously. He's not a traditional key forward. He's more of a medium that plays a little taller, and he's a bull. That's one of his nicknames. So I do hope that we're able to see some consistency from him based on the fact that we've given him quite a long-term contract there. And then Paul Curtis versus Zane Dersma. These are the sorts of ones that I don't know where to go. Obviously, exposed form. Curtis has played better football. Dersma's had 1 year of AFL football versus Curtis's 3 or 4 at this point. So it's a tough one. I do think that Dersma's ceiling is probably higher, but which of them is a more valuable player to us? Feel free to debate this one with me in the comments as well. I actually think I'm going to go with Dersma because I think his ceiling is higher. I don't want to give up either of them, and this is where it's going to become difficult the more we go on because none of these are ones that you'd want to give up, really. But if you had to choose one, I think Dersma is probably, well, like I said, he's got a higher ceiling, I think. He could be absolutely anything. He could go on to be a really strong midfield forward. He could just be a really, really lightning jet, high-flying mark in that forward line. But he also could be a flop. There is that chance. But I think based on potential, we saw flashes of brilliance from him. He's such a good mark. I think I'd pick him if I had to get rid of one of them. It would be short-term pain because Paul Curtis is a really strong performer in our forward line, but I think Dersma has potential to be a better player long-term. Midfielders, or the midfield section, Tristan Xerri versus Finn O'Sullivan. To be honest, I'm going to go Tristan Xerri, and the reason is similar to the one above that I just did. Xerri is harder to replace than Finn O'Sullivan, and we have less exposed form for Finn O'Sullivan in that we have none. It's easier to find midfielders than it is to find a ruckman of Xerri's quality, which again, we wouldn't have been saying 12 months ago with that amount of confidence. But I think Xerri is a more valuable player to us as a side than Finn O'Sullivan, even if O'Sullivan ends up being a better player in his position, if that makes sense. I just think, we've got some other midfielders on our list like Wardlaw and Sheasel that, will play similar roles long-term to Finn O'Sullivan in that they're midfielders. So, for me, Xerri, I think, has to win that matchup. And then Wardlaw versus LDU. I'm going LDU here. And again, it's more based on the fact that he's in that perfect age profile that we need. So if you're going to lose one, I think you would lose Wardlaw just because, again, there's a little bit more of an unknown quantity. LDU, we know what we're getting. We're getting one of the best midfielders in the comp, whereas Wardlaw is potentially one of the best midfielders in the comp. And I think for that reason, you want to hold on to LDU. He's got plenty of years left. He'd be, 24, 25 LDU? Let me have a look. Yeah, he's 25 years old. So absolutely coming into his prime years. You don't want to lose him if you can avoid it. And that's what we're hoping to do this year with our contract negotiations. So if I could only hold on to one, I'm holding on to LDU there. Sheasel and Simpkin, unfortunately, based on what we've seen from Simpkin the last year or two, it's a pretty straightforward Sheasel one there. He's the future captain. I think we all know that. How long until that happens, I'm not too sure, but yeah, it's Sheasel winning that one, unfortunately for Jai. And then Comben versus Luke Parker is the last second round matchup. Comben versus Parker. I mean, it's got to be Charlie Comben, right? Because it's a long-term potential versus short-term success with Parker. I am pretty high on what Comben can be. I'm not sky high. I do think there are flaws in his game that he needs to work on, but you know, it's similar to that discussion that I just had with Sherry versus O'Sullivan. It's going to be easier to replace a player like Parker than it is to replace a place like Charlie Comben. So for that reason, I think we've got to go Charlie Comben is the more valuable player. All right, this is where it gets interesting. So that's round 2 done. Now essentially, well, it's not essentially, now what we have is the playoff for the best player in each area of the ground. So this, I guess, is the quarterfinals. Then we've got a semi-final, and then we've got a final coming. We've got 8 players left. Just to go through them, those players are Aidan Corr, Griffin Logue, Nick Larkey, Zane Dersma, Tristan Sherry, Luke Davies-Uniacke, Harry Sheasel, Charlie Comben. All right, defenders, Griffin Logue versus Aidan Corr. This is an easy one. It's Griffin Logue, just based on age and, you know, future impact. If you're going to give up one of those, you're giving up Aidan Corr because he's got less time left. That's basically it, really. They're pretty similar players in terms of what they will give you on the field in terms of output. They do play slightly different roles, cause more of a lockdown, whereas Logue can be more of an interceptor, I think, and can potentially give you a little bit more offensively. He's a better mark, Griffin Logue, as well, and younger. So Griffin Logue, I think, is more valuable than Aidan Corr. Larkey versus Dersma. I mean, now I'm going to contradict myself probably with the Curtis situation, but I mean, Larkey is a more important player to us than Zane Dersma. He's committed long term. He also could be a future captain if we wanted to hand it over to someone else before Harry Sheasel. I think Larkey would be someone that you would look at. Far more exposed form. The better we are as a team, the better he's going to be. So Nick Larkey, I think, has to be more valuable than Zane Dersma. If Zane Dersma was maybe 3 or 4 years into his career and was showing some really elite signs consistently, I think that's when we have more of a debate about it. But yeah, you can't argue with Larkey's ability to kick goals in pretty bad sides. That's a tough skill to have. So Larkey wins that one. LDU versus Tristan Sherry. Yeah, I mean, here is where it gets interesting because I think you have to go with LDU because he's, you know, like I mentioned before, one of the best 10, 15 players in the comp. Gosh, it's so funny thinking 12 months ago this would not even be a debate. It's LDU every day of the week. And I think ultimately, in terms of, he's just such a jet. He's got such burst away from stoppage. You know, he has a higher ceiling than Tristan Sherry does. They're both kind of in their primes in terms of their age profile, but yeah, I just don't think you want to give up elite midfielders. You know, if they're a good midfielder, that's different to an elite midfielder or a potentially elite midfielder is different again. So I think you've got to give this one to LDU on exposed form because a player that good is just so hard to replace. Like I said, in his prime, he's going to, for the next 4 or 5 years, he's going to be one hell of a player, which might be the case as well for Sherry, but I guess the ruck position is one where maybe you can get away with downgrading, which even as I'm saying it, you're kind of contradicting arguments that I used earlier on. But yeah, I just think LDU, it has to be him there because, you know, he's one of our best players, as is Sherry. But I think LDU is probably a tier above in terms of the type of player he is in his position. Yeah, that would be an interesting one to hear your thoughts on in the comments. And again, makes us think about how much we don't want to lose LDU to someone else at the end of this coming season. And then the last one, Harry Sheasel, Charlie Comben. Yeah, I mean, it's Sheasel. It's interesting because normally this is where I would be thinking to myself, well, you take the key position player. But I do think, look, Sheezel's a generational talent. He's the sort of player that, sure, he was a really high draft pick, but he's one of those high draft picks that's even better than you could have imagined once you actually get him. Whereas, I think there's often you'll grab a high draft pick and you go, yep, we knew he was good and he's good. Sheezel is a level up from that. He is the sort of player that he's got the full package. He can play multiple positions. He's a great leader. He speaks well. Good luck finding a fault. Charlie Comben, unfortunately, has a couple of faults in that he's got some injury concerns. Like I said, I don't love his set shot goal kicking, and he's not yet able to play as a one-on-one key defender. So, I mean, he has massive, massive potential, but Sheezel is a gun now. Comben could be a super, super important player, maybe. So it has to be Sheezel. So I guess they're the four most important players for each area of the ground. Obviously, that Sheezel dual position player section kind of ruins it a little bit. Logue, Larkey, LDU, and Harry Sheezel, which means we have now those matchups playing against each other for the final deciding. So Logue is going up against Larkey, defenders versus forwards, and LDU against Sheezel, mids against dual position players. Logue versus Larkey, I think, has to go to Nick Larkey, based on the fact that he's been our leading goal kicker for however many years. He is a leader of the club and has sustained form at that level. Interesting to think about how old is Nick Larkey. So he's 26 as well. He's one of those ones, because he's been around for such a long time at the club now, you can think to yourself, oh, he's getting on a bit. Not really. He's only 26. So similar age to Griffin Logue. Certainly Larkey has played better football for us than Griffin Logue has, but that's partly because of Logue's injury history, and partly because he's come across from Fremantle. But yeah, I mean, it's super, super hard to find a player in the forward line of Larkey's quality. As we get better, he is going to be really, really hard to defend. So yeah, I mean, I think it's Larkey pretty comfortably over Griffin Logue. The defenders is definitely an area of the ground that is quite weak for us, because whilst it was hard for me to decide some of those matchups, it wasn't necessarily because they were too strong ones coming up against each other. It was, we've got this player with potential coming up, this player that's on the way out. Like, there's different kind of conversations to what I've been thinking about in terms of the forward line players. So Larkey wins the defenders versus forwards battle. And then the other semi-final, LDU versus Sheezel, well, yeah, I mean, it's got to be Sheezel, right? Like, they're both pretty similar in terms of the quality of the player. They play differently, don't get me wrong, but I think, in terms of the output we've got from them from the last 2 years, pretty comparable. Sheezel's probably been slightly more consistent, but the highs for LDU have probably been slightly higher. But the fact that Sheezel's only played 2 years of footy, he's got 10, 12, 15 potentially if he plays on to his 35 good years ahead of him, versus LDU, who's, I think done with year 7 now, so coming into year 8. There's just more time that we could spend with Sheezel, and I think they're pretty comparable in terms of their impact on us winning. So if you're going to give up one, I think you give up the older one when they're kind of this close. Again, I don't want to give up either of them, but that's the point of the bracket, I guess, is to get you to think about, or get me to think about, which of these players would you rather keep. And so, yeah, that leaves us with the last one being Larkey versus Sheezel. And I think it's a pretty easy decision. Oh, I mean, the thing about Larkey is he's a key position player. And I've kept harping on about the fact that does impact the decisions, or my decision-making slightly. But again, when it's a generational talent like Sheezel, it's kind of hard to deny him. Oh, it's a tough one. I think if we were doing this at the end of last year, I'd probably say Larkey, because Larkey was coming off an All-Australian year where he's kicked 60 plus. Sheezel's only had 1 year and he's played it at halfback and potentially not a fluke, but potentially transitioning that into different areas of the ground, it was a little bit of an uncertainty. But now that we know that Sheezel can do it pretty much anywhere, and Larkey didn't have quite as strong a 2024, I think at this point in time, it has to be Sheez. Like, if we're going to be giving up one of them, I'd say neither. But, I mean, yeah, Sheezel is generational. Larkey, whilst he's a phenomenal player, there probably are more similar players to him in the competition than there are players similar to Sheezel. Like, with Sheez, I think of Nick Dacos. I think of Marcus Bontempelli. Like, there aren't too many players that I think of in the same echelon as what Harry Sheezel could be in 10 years' time. Whereas, Larkey is a really good key forward, and there are other really good key forwards around the competition. Like, most sides have one, some sides have two, and you can debate about, where where Larkey fits in that hierarchy. But for me, yeah, I think if I had to give up one, I'd give up Larkey, and probably end up kicking no goals for the rest of the season. But yeah, Sheezel's just the full package. He's got every single thing, and he doesn't really have a weakness. So yeah, there's my most important player bracket. Like I said, would love to debate some of this with you. I'm no way am saying that as I said, I've done this off the cuff, so potentially I'll think about this and maybe want to change a couple of my decisions. The Dersma versus Curtis one comes to mind. That's a really tight one. Sherry versus O'Sullivan, which was one of the early ones, similar. Like, it's really tough to know where to go there. There's a few that I'm not sure about. Maybe you think I got one horribly wrong. So would love to debate it with you. Who do you think is North Melbourne's most important or valuable player to us right now, and which of these players would be the last one that you would trade if we're trading everyone or everyone's on the free market? I think for me, ending up with Sheezel is fair, because if you're going to have everyone lined up along the fence, you're selecting the first player that you want for your side. Yeah, I mean, I think you're taking Sheezel, and if Sheezel's not available, you're taking Larkey, and then if neither of them are available, you're probably taking LDU. But Griffin Logue was the other one that ended up in the top 4. He's probably not the fourth one you'd select, so that's probably where the bracket becomes. You'd need to go down back to a ranking, because, yeah, I would probably be taking someone like Sherry or even Dersma before I took Griffin Logue. But anyway, we're talking about something different there. Sheezel wins the most important or valuable player. From me, love to hear your thoughts. Who do you think the most important player is, and who did I get it horribly wrong on? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well. That's going to do us for this podcast for this week. Like I said, I have recorded in advance, so you're hearing this from the past or you're listening to this in the future. It's one of the two, depending on how you choose to think of it. I'll be back next week with some more timeless content. It sounds a little bit arrogant, but I'm more so saying it's not time sensitive. And hope you're having a great off-season, and looking forward to getting into the pre-season vibes in the next few weeks. As always, go North. We'll be back. Thanks for listening to another episode of NorthPod. If you give me a rating or review on your podcast service, that would be much appreciated. And please follow me on all social media at NorthPod Show. I'm on X or Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, and I'm also very active on the North Melbourne subreddit. Hope you'll join me for the next episode.